This video is brought to you by Squarespace and their new design intelligence. It's the 1950s and new technology is being rapidly developed. The arms race between East and West is ramping up, and the fear is what drives the development of the incredible project that we're covering today. Fear from the traumatic destruction the US Navy experienced in the Pacific during the Pearl Harbor attack, but also the fear of devastating nuclear war that might come in the future. There is a need for a new type of plane, one that could adapt to wars of the past and of the future. One that could take off from pretty much anywhere or off pretty much anything, sporting heavy armaments, and the enemy would never see it coming. And while it never saw service, its development was incredibly important for the many different types of aircraft that we see today. This is what happens when a helicopter meets a plane, the Lockheed XF-V1. Now, after watching that intro, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, Nick, haven't we already covered this plane on Found and Explained? That was actually the Convair XFY Pogo, the main rival of the aircraft that we're talking about today that was part of the same competition. And its backstory was pretty much the same. After the end of World War II, the world entered what we now know as the Cold War. Many airfields were built during World War II and were used by the US and its allies all across Europe. It was very well known that air superiority was critical for attacking the enemy, but also halting their advance. Therefore, the US believed that their airfields would be the first thing that the Soviets would try hitting. So what if there was a plane that could not only take off without a runway, but could also be deployed quickly to counter any attack from the enemy, such as a nuclear one? Remember, this was the late 1940s and the early 1950s, so bombers were still the primary means of nuclear attack. The Pentagon believed that a fighter that could take off quickly and down a bomber could certainly be an invaluable asset. The Navy, however, wanted to use this concept to avoid disasters from the past. During World War II, the US needed aircraft carriers in order to launch aerial attacks. This in turn meant that aircraft carriers were the primary target of Japanese kamikaze pilots. And if a military convoy was without an aircraft carrier, then they could kiss goodbye their ability to retaliate with aircraft of their own. The US Navy would end up losing a lot of ships because they couldn't intercept enemy fighters, so they wanted to develop the vertical takeoff and landing concept in order to have planes that could not only take off from just aircraft carriers, but other vessels as well, so they could quickly intercept the enemy and protect their fleet. They started a contest called the Navy Convoy Fighter Program in 1948, and several companies applied, but Lockheed and Convair's bids looked the most promising. The game was on. Part of the reason why we don't see aircraft like this, or derivatives of its type, flying around is because the engineers couldn't get enough support for its design in Washington. It makes you realize that had they had today's technology, not only could have they solved the flaws with the aircraft's handling using artificial intelligence, but they also could have built a killer website using Squarespace to get more funding. That's right, the amazing Squarespace website creator has combined 2 decades of industry-leading design expertise with cutting-edge AI technology to unlock your strongest creative potential yet, allowing you to make more than just aircraft like this. Squarespace actually recommends a fantastic design to reach your goals when you're creating a website, creating a more beautiful, more personalized website, crafting a bespoke digital identity, and never looking like a template again. The game has finally changed. But building a website is only the beginning with Squarespace, because you can also run email campaigns, get more customers, and even launch courses. Say for example how to build a VTOL plane. So if you want to teach, Squarespace is now your one-stop shop for your entire educational portal. And I love Squarespace so much that I even use it for my online store at www.foundandexplained.shop. So head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch your own site or launch your own aircraft, go to www.squarespace.com/found and get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. The first design that Lockheed submitted was called the L200. They wanted to show the Navy that they could build whatever they needed. This originally had an 8-bladed propeller and only 3 wings on the tail. They also offered versions with an afterburner, swept wings, and canards. The Navy awarded them the contract in 1951, and thus they actually started working on a production version called the XF-01. O was the Navy's original designation for Lockheed, but they later changed it to V, hence the name XF-V1. Now that they were in with the Navy, Lockheed wasn't going to let those hacks from Convair beat them. So they brought in one of the most legendary aircraft engineers in history, Kelly Johnson. This was the same man who designed the P-38 Lightning and the P-80 Shooting Star, so he already had plenty of experience building fantastic fighters. And of course, he would go on to build his more incredible aircraft, the U-2 spy plane and the very famous SR-71 Blackbird. He was absolutely the best man for the job. So his team decided to add a 4th flight surface to the back of the plane, creating the characteristic cruciform V-tail. The entire thing looked weird and kind of similar to its rival from Convair, the XF-Y1 Pogo. And how exactly did it compare to its rival? Well, the lake was 36 feet, making this aircraft larger than the Pogo, but surprisingly, the Convair Pogo was heavier, albeit just slightly. On the Lockheed version, they decided to make the wings much more standard so they weren't as swept as the Pogo. And powered by the Ellison XT40A6 turboprop, the entire thing would sit on its tail that had wheels for landing and takeoff. And during takeoff, it would gradually switch from vertical to horizontal flight mode. For this reason, the plane had a chair that would rotate based on what the orientation of the aircraft was flying in, but I'll get to that in a minute. Of course, since it was a combat aircraft, it was also equipped with 4 20mm cannons or rocket pods. With a mocked-up prototype ready to go, the testing was done by Herman Salmon, and this guy had a nickname called Fish for obviously reasons. And yes, his last name is where we got the nickname for this aircraft as well. On December 23rd of 1953, he managed to accidentally make a hop with the plane during taxiing, proving this prototype could work. So after ironing out all of the kinks, Lockheed would have a winner on its hands. Well, that's what the engineers thought, because in reality, not really. If you watched a video on the Convair Pogo, then you already know some of the problems that this aircraft faced. The absolute worst one was how to land the thing. In the intro, I described this as a combination of a plane and a helicopter. However, the propellers were simply not large enough like on a helicopter, and there was no tail rotor. This made coming in to land incredibly difficult in terms of generating enough lift to hover above the surface and also rotating the aircraft around to ensure that it was facing the right way. And this wasn't helped at all by the fact that the pilot was effectively on their back, so the approach was incredibly difficult. The pilot couldn't see where they were going. Now, as we mentioned, Lockheed did plan for this last problem, and scale testing models had a rotating cockpit, but this never made it into the prototypes. The plane, however, did manage to take off in 1954, but if you look at the footage closely, you'll see that in order to do so, it had to make use of an improvised undercarriage, and just take off the old-fashioned way like any other turboprop. The truth is, it never actually made a full-on vertical takeoff and landing whilst switching to horizontal. You can see it switch modes in mid-air in some footage, but the takeoff itself was done mostly horizontally. This is in part because the engines were simply not powerful enough, and whilst there were plans to use the beefier Ellison T54 engine, you stack up all the other issues, there was no way this concept was ever going to work, and on June 16, 1955, the project was cancelled. Herman Salmon, who during his career flew many other aircraft, which included the P-38, P-80, XF-90, and the YF-104, said that the XF-V was one of the most dangerous and difficult planes to control, and that continuing development was hopeless. And in a big way he was right, because this was a propeller aircraft, which at that point in time was seen as relics on fighters. The Navy and Air Force ended up going with jets instead, and at that point they were getting faster and faster and were better suited for intercept missions. And as we know, in a few years later, there would start to be nuclear jet bombers, which a propeller plane would never be able to catch up with. But we shouldn't dismiss the XF-Y and the XF-V. They needed to walk so modern VTOL aircraft could, well, fly. Lockheed would go on to build the XV-4 Hummingbird and combine the gained experience to build the F-35 Lightning II, which by all intents and purposes is a successful aircraft. Propeller VTOL aircraft didn't go away at all, even though the design had to completely change to work. And if you watched our video on the V-280 Valor, then you know that they will absolutely become a thing into the future, and replace pretty much all helicopters that we know today. So thanks again for watching yet another Cold War insanity story, and the other side of the already covered Pogo story. And if you're new to the channel and you haven't actually checked out the tale of the Convair Pogo, then I suggest you go check that out right after this video. Thanks for watching,